Oh, hello, you're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96 with Belinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we have just completed the Jazz Zone, and Chen Providence has just paid tribute to the OJs, the mighty OJs, Eddie Levert, Walter Williams, and the late, great William Powell. And we're getting ready to interview Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of about 50 books. And he is a regular on this particular show for decades now. And first of all, Dr. Horne, could you give us the name of your current book and the pre-order situation? How are your books doing right now, especially the current one?
So the current book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, available for pre-order. It should be dropping in a day or two or so. You could see it as a sequel to some of my earlier works, for example, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, The Origin of the United States of America. That is to say, it seeks to demolish this idea that the United States creation was some great leap forward for humanity, may have been a great leap forward for certain men of European descent, but it was a great leap backward for the indigenous, who started off controlling most of North America, west of the so-called 13 colonies, and then within decades had lost all of their land, and many of them had been exterminated. And likewise, with regard to the Africans, there were thousands at the time of the formation of the United States in 1776, millions by the verge of the U.S. Civil War, 1861. And I dare say that you cannot begin to understand the crisis, both domestically and globally, which Washington has plunged this country and this world into, without a comprehension of the misreading of the formation of the United States of America, not least by some of our friends on the left, and I'm afraid to say, by some of our friends in Canada as well. But let me just make a footnote with regard to that latter point. I had the opportunity to see Prime Minister Carney of Canada take his oath of office to assume that lofty post. And even though I was well aware King Charles III is the sovereign, is the head of state, so to speak, and will be visiting Canada within days, I was struck, taken aback by Prime Minister Carney pledging allegiance to King Charles III. I mean, what a contradiction, since Britain is trying to cut its own deals with the United States of America at the same time that Mr. Trump has made clear he wants to annex Canada, which is supposedly part of King Charles III's jurisdiction. I mean, what a contradiction. And then it gave me reason to understand why there has been a so-called Republican movement in Canada, that is to say, to remove King Charles III as the sovereign. But once again, I think that movement would gain traction if the Republican forces in Canada would issue a critique of the trajectory of republicanism south of the border in the United States of America. Because obviously it's replete with contradictions, and it seems to me at least that it's going to be difficult to have republicanism in Canada take hold as long as there's no critique of republicanism in the United States of America. I'm sure the ordinary Canadian would say, you want us to emulate the United States of America? Well, obviously they don't, but until you do a critique of republicanism, I think that is a reasonable question.
Well, I think you and I probably disagreed on, I think we talked about it before, but I used to argue that the only difference between Canada, slavery, and the U.S. and Canada was, couldn't grow cotton up here, and the South Africans learned apartheid from from Canada. That's where they studied. They studied how the First Nations people were treated in Canada. I know we had talked about that many years ago.
Well, raising South Africa allows us to raise the first point in terms of this blow up in the Oval Office between the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Mr. Trump. Mr. Ramaphosa came to Washington in order to reset relations. That's his term, not mine, with Washington. But he was ambushed by Mr. Trump, which is becoming to be an ordinary story with regard to visits by heads of state and government. You get ambushed in the Oval Office, which is going to make it very difficult for other heads of state and government, unless they are, of course, presumably those who are melanin deficient, because I noticed that with Mr. Ramaphosa, Mr. Trump was quite friendly to the melanin deficient members of his delegation, but was not as forthcoming towards the African members of its delegation. Of course, the trigger was this idea of so-called white genocide. That is to say, this fallacy that the regime in Pretoria is executing a genocide against those of European descent. And I think it's important, once again, when we do this critique of Republic States of America, to acknowledge that resonates with his base.
And you're listening to Diasporic Music. We are in the Horne Report, and we have on the phone Gerald Horne. And did you want to continue? We were talking about South African in the White House, basically, the White House blow up that happened.
Well, as noted, Mr. Trump brought out video and newspaper articles, most of which were based upon spurious sources, purporting to show that there's some sort of genocide against the so-called Afrikaners, dozens of whom have arrived on these shores at the U.S. taxpayers' expense and are now being put up in various houses and homes, while you have a spiraling unhoused population in the United States of America, not to mention the fact that Mr. Trump is in the process of deporting tens of thousands of Venezuelans and Haitians, for example. There's a recent story about how Cubans and Mexicans and Laotians were put on a plane and sent to Africa. Supposedly, they were slated to land in South Sudan, wound up in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. And so one cannot think of a more dramatic episode in terms of the double standards, the hypocrisy, the white supremacy of the United States of America than what we saw in the White House just a few days ago with this attack, not only on Mr. Ramaphosa, but also on the South African state, because we know that the victims of criminal activity in South Africa are not necessarily disproportionately the Afrikaner minority, it's the African majority. But in order to get a firmer grasp and grip on this question, you have to ask yourself, why does Mr. Trump feel that this particular episode in the Oval Office does not hurt him with his constituency? And in fact, it helps him with his constituency. Why does Mr. Trump feel that attacking Haitians, as he did during the presidential campaign of 2024, charging that those Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, were eating the cats and dogs of their neighbors? Why does he feel that that helps him with his constituency as opposed to hurting him with his constituency? And I think when you begin to analyze that particular issue, you begin to understand that the constituency that propelled Mr. Trump into office, 77 million strong at the ballot box in November of 2024, they may have a firmer understanding of the history of the United States than some of our friends on the left, because from their point of view, Mr. Trump is standing up as the defender of white supremacy, as the defender of those defined as, quote, white, unquote. And they think that that is a good thing.
Uhuru, you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson. And Dr. Horne,
We were talking about
continue.
South Africa in the White House still, so the last little bit. You want to jump back in?
Well, I was saying that South Africa and the United States mirror each other in terms of apartheid and Jim Crow, which is not to say that other capitalist countries have been bereft of racism or anti-blackness in general. But having said that, it's no doubt that South Africa and the United States stand heads and shoulders above the rest. And any attempt to denigrate that particular notion basically gives a pass to U.S. imperialism. Why anybody would want to give a pass to U.S. imperialism is beyond me. There's a tendency in the United States, I've noticed, that with regard to the United States, the left-wing patriots, they defend the United States from the right. That is to say, they defend the United States as being similar to other capitalist countries and not any worse. And then they oftentimes attack their own countries from the left, for example, in terms of pointing to their abilities, for example, to show how they're similar to the United States. But in any case, this also speaks to the question of why South Africa has had such a difficult road. Because even though historians such as myself have written in painstaking detail about the process leading up to the elections of 1994 that ushered out of existence the apartheid regime, we pointed out the chronology that the ANC, the African National Congress, and their allies were unbanned by the regime in February 1990, which comes as a direct result of the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, whereby the major ally of the anti-apartheid forces, speaking of East Germany, Socialist German Democratic Republic, was weakened severely, which in turn weakened the ANC negotiating team, which meant that they could not negotiate a sound, optimal deal. That weakness was exacerbated more to the point in December 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, which was a major force backing not only Socialist East Germany, but the ANC in South Africa itself. That's where comrades went for rest and recuperation. That's where they received medical aid. That's where they got their arms from. And I think part of the issue is that despite the fact that we had a strong anti-apartheid movement in North America, it's no secret that many of the liberals were hostile to the ANC because of its alliance with the South African Communist Party. They were hostile on anti-communist grounds. We know that there are liberals with us today. I'm speaking of Adam Hochschild, who is a prominent writer for the New York Times and New York Review of Books, particularly on issues involving people of African descent, although he's an inheritor of a fortune based upon investments in the corporation formerly known as American Metals Climax, then AMAX, which profited handsomely from exploitation of African resources, particularly in the Congo, particularly cheap African labor. He is just an emblem of a larger liberal trend in the United States of America. And as I hinted in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, and I'll elaborate further in my book coming out on China, that there was this Maoist trend, which was hostile to the South African Communist Party because it was perceived as being allied with the Soviet Union. That trend was embedded in a certain kind of Black nationalist, Black power framework. And in fact, one of the characters that I talk about in the South African book, and we'll talk about further in the China book, was a CIA FBI informant codenamed Sugar, still in the land of the living, unmasked accidentally as the CIA FBI informant. And of course, now in his 90s, he was very close to a number of Black power icons who he was able to push even further towards hostility to the ANC and the South African Communist Party. And so this is all on the record. and this hampered the ANC with regard to its negotiations. But having said that, we would be remiss if we let off the hook leaders like Jacob Zuma, the third president of South Africa, leader from 2009 to 2018, a man who engaged in boundless corruption, a man who in 2021, after being ousted from office, stood aside as an insurrection was organized in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal on the Indian Ocean coast, wherein dozens were slaughtered. A man who organized a party to run against the ANC in last year's elections, which helped to, on chauvinist and ultra-nationalist, dare I say, tribalistic bases, drive the ANC below the 50% margin, which it had enjoyed in previous elections, which then drove it into this shotgun marriage with the pro-apartheid party, Democratic Alliance. And so what this should remind us all is that this struggle against these powerful imperialist forces, as much as we would like it to be rather smooth and easy, is rather difficult, not least because of this settler colonial phenomenon, which many do not even talk about, even though it is the operative principle here in North America, which involved, of course, indigenous dispossession on both sides of the Canadian-US border, but mass enslavement of Africans on the south side of the border. And I might also add a footnote, which is that when the United States came into existence, 1776, Canada was largely Quebec, and Quebec was largely based upon French colonialism, which was largely based upon extraction. That is to say, trapping, fur trapping in particular. That's why you have this phenomenon still in Canada called the Métis, who are the offspring of unions between the French and the indigenous. Where I am sitting now in British Columbia, there was that extractive colonialism as well, until the Yankees began to pour into what they call the state of Washington and the state of Oregon, which drove the British and what we might call the Canadians out of that territory. And then you had the origins of settler colonialism in British Columbia as a direct result of Uncle Sam. So people really need to get their history straight if they're going to talk about these complex issues.
And you're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. You have another, go ahead.
Yeah, one is we have about 6 minutes. We want to talk about Israel, the Israel crisis right now.
Well, the crisis is mushrooming. First of all, there is an apparent rift between U.S. imperialism and Israel. We saw it with regard to Mr. Trump's jump to the Gulf monarchs, including the UAE, the Saudis, the Qataris. He conspicuously did not visit Israel. It puts a new light upon the Oval Office meeting with Mr. Netanyahu, which I guess we can group with the meetings with Ramaphosa and Zelensky, because perhaps we didn't realize it at the time, but Mr. Trump, with Mr. Netanyahu sitting 1 foot away, announced that he was going to be embarked on a peace deal or an anti-nuclear deal with Iran. And it's apparent that Mr. Trump is being, in a sense, bought off by the Gulf monarchies, the Qataris, who have gifted him a $400 million flying palace, not to mention the UAE, which is involved with his sons in various enterprises. And this is going to have very damaging impact on Africa, given the fact that the UAE is involved up to its eyeballs in supporting religious zealots in the Sahel region, not to mention supporting one side of what amounts to a Sudanese civil war. But the Israel crisis is also exemplified by the point that at the Arab League meeting in Iraq just a few days ago, the Spanish Prime Minister arrived. And of course, next month, June 2025, we're expecting a mass recognition of a Palestinian state, including by a number of important European states, which heretofore have been in the back pocket of Israel. We also took note of the joint statement by Prime Minister Carney of Canada, French President Macron, and Prime Minister Starmer of Great Britain, which was quite sharply critical of Israeli depredations in Gaza, for example. So this is a major mushrooming crisis that Israel is facing. They seem to have only one approach when faced with a crisis, which is massacring more Palestinians, for example. And it does not appear that that particular approach will pay any dividends going forward. And in fact, this escape from Israeli designs and clutches is something that I dare say will be part of the landscape globally for some months to come.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. You want to continue, Melinda?
Yeah, we have about 2 minutes left. Did you want to talk about the fire in West Africa or West Africa on fire?
Well, what's happening in West Africa now is another crisis. Part of it can be gleaned from what I just said about the UAE's role in that part of Africa. But there were all these stories last week that turned out not to be accurate about a coup d'etat in Cote d'Ivoire. I think it was wishful thinking on the part of opponents, but at the same time, I do think that the Sahel regimes, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, their influence is spreading also to otherwise neo-colonial regimes like that of President Ouattara in Ivory Coast. At the same time, you have unrest in Nigeria, which you might recall at the time of the change of regime in neighboring Niger a year or two ago, threatened to invade Niger. And so West Africa, in a sense, is on tenterhooks right now, because on the one hand, you have the Sahel states already mentioned, which are embarking on a new path of development. On the other hand, you have these old school regimes, such as Cote d'Ivoire, Niger, etc., which are unwilling to embark on a new path. And I think that we got a glimpse of what the future holds, not only when we saw the inauguration of John Mahama in Ghana, when the leader of Burkina Faso, Mr. Traore, received rapturous ovations from those Ghanaian masses assembled, but you saw something similar with the inauguration of the new leader of Gabon, speaking of Mr. Nguema, who overthrew the Bongo dynasty some months ago. The representative of Burkina Faso, once again, was greeted with rapturous applause. And so it may not be overly optimistic to suggest that we may be on the verge of a new day with brighter horizons for West Africa. And if that is the case, I can say that it's not coming a moment too soon.
And you are listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. And we are going to, we will be looking forward to checking you out, sir.
Right on.
All right. And Melinda Francis, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'd like, our listeners to stay safe during the week, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.